I've been asked to speak today, and for a while I sat with the question of what would actually be worth saying to you. Not what sounds good, not what fits neatly into a few quotable lines, but what might actually change something for you 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when you're standing at some fork in the road that you can't yet see. And the more I sat with that question, the more I kept coming back to one thing. Not a strategy, not a technique, not a 5-step framework. Just one word: confidence. Because if I look back honestly at every major turn in my life, the good ones and the ones that hurt, the difference was never really talent, and it was never really luck, although luck plays its part. The difference was whether I believed, in that specific moment, that I was allowed to try. I want to tell you a story about how I came to understand that, because I don't think it's something you can just be told. I think it's something you have to almost stumble into, the way you stumble into most real understanding. And maybe if I walk you through how it happened for me, some of it will click into place a little faster for you than it did for me. There's an old idea I ran into when I was maybe 19 in a secondhand book that had nothing to do with psychology or self-help. It was a line about how the walls that stop us are rarely the ones in front of us. They're the ones we built years ago in a room we've already left. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but it stayed lodged somewhere in my head the way certain sentences do, waiting for enough life experience to catch up to them. Years later, I understood it perfectly. Most of what stops people isn't the actual obstacle in front of them. It's an old verdict handed down a long time ago, often by someone who didn't even mean much by it, that quietly became a permanent ruling on who we're allowed to be. But let me start at the beginning, because the beginning matters here. I was not a confident kid. I want to be honest about that because I think it's important, and because the version of this story where I tell you I was always fearless and bold would be a lie, and it also wouldn't help you. I was the kid who rehearsed sentences in his head before saying them out loud, just in case they came out wrong. I was the kid who, if I raised my hand in class and got the answer wrong, would feel it in my chest for the rest of the day, this low hum of embarrassment that colored everything after it. I avoided anything where I might be seen failing. Sports, tryouts, auditions, the school debate team, all of it. Not because I didn't want those things, I wanted them badly. I avoided them because wanting something and then failing at it publicly felt unbearable, and not wanting it at all or pretending not to want it felt so much safer. And here's the thing nobody tells you about that kind of self-protection. It works, it really does protect you. You avoid the sting of public failure. But it costs you something enormous in exchange, something you don't notice you're losing because the loss is quiet. It's not a dramatic collapse. It's just years slipping by where you never find out what you were actually capable of because you never gave yourself the chance to be seen trying. I remember very specifically the day something shifted, even if the shift itself took years to complete. I was in a class, and the teacher put forward a question that almost nobody in the room understood, and I had this half-formed thought in my head that I was almost certain was right, but not completely certain. And I did the thing I always did. I sat on my hands, literally sat on my hands, because some part of me had learned that this physically stopped me from raising them. And a classmate, a kid who was by no means smarter than me, just raised his hand, said something that was maybe 60% right, got corrected by the teacher, adjusted his answer on the spot, and ended up basically arriving at the same place my half-formed thought would have gotten to, except he got there out loud in front of everyone, and I got there silently, where it counted for nothing. And I remember thinking, with this strange little jolt, that the difference between us in that moment had nothing to do with what either of us knew. It had to do with what each of us was willing to risk being seen not knowing. That was the beginning of a very long and very slow rebuilding process for me, and I want to walk you through the actual mechanics of it, because I think the mechanics matter more than the moral of the story. The first thing I had to understand, and this took embarrassingly long, is that confidence is not a feeling you wait for. This is probably the single most important thing I can tell you today, so let me say it as plainly as I can. Confidence is not something that arrives before you act, like a green light that turns on and then you go. For most people, for almost everyone I've ever actually respected, it works the other way around. You act first, in a state that feels much closer to fear than confidence, and the confidence is built afterward, brick by brick out of the evidence that you survived. Confidence is not the cause of brave action, it is the residue of it. I think this gets misunderstood constantly because we watch people who already have confidence and we assume they must have started with it. We see someone speak fluently in a meeting, or start a business without flinching, or walk into a room and own it, and we think, well, that person was simply born that way. They have some quality I don't have. But almost every person like that, if you actually ask them, has some version of my classroom story. Some early moment where they were terrified and did the thing anyway badly and did not die from it, and filed that survival away as data, and then did it again and again. Confidence, in other words, is not a personality trait. It's a compounding asset, and like any compounding asset, it's boring and slow at the start, and then eventually it becomes enormous. So once I understood that, the question changed for me. It stopped being how do I become confident and became how do I engineer small survivable moments of risk on purpose, often enough that the evidence starts piling up. That reframing changed everything about how I approached the next 10 years of my life. And I want to walk you through some of those chapters because each one taught me something slightly different, and I think each lesson is worth having on its own. The first real test came when I was starting out in work, in that stretch of life where you're desperate to prove you belong and terrified that you don't. I had an idea in a meeting, a genuinely good one I still believe, about how we could restructure a process that was wasting a huge amount of time and money for the small company I was working at. And I sat on it for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of watching the inefficiency continue, watching people work harder than they needed to, because I was so afraid that if I proposed it and it turned out to be a bad idea, or if it turned out someone senior had already thought of it and rejected it, for reasons I didn't know, I would look foolish in front of people whose opinion I desperately wanted. Eventually, mostly out of frustration with my own cowardice, more than actual bravery, I brought it up. My voice cracked a little when I started talking, I remember that specifically. And the idea was not perfect. There were holes in it that a more senior colleague pointed out within about 90 seconds. But here's what actually happened, and this is the part that mattered. Nobody laughed. Nobody remembered it a week later as some embarrassing moment. What they remembered, if they remembered anything at all, was that the imperfect idea led to a conversation, and the conversation led to a better version of the idea, and the better version actually got implemented, and it saved real time and real money. My name got attached to that, not because the original idea was flawless, but because I was the one who said something out loud instead of sitting on it. The lesson I took from that, and I want to state it directly because I think it's easy to nod along and not actually absorb it. The cost of a mediocre idea spoken aloud is almost always smaller than you think, and the cost of a good idea left unspoken is almost always larger than you think. We wildly overestimate how much people are scrutinizing us, and wildly underestimate the compounding cost of our own silence. Most people are not waiting to catch you being wrong. Most people are simply not thinking about you nearly as much as your anxiety insists they are. That sounds almost too simple to be useful, but once you actually internalize it, it removes an enormous amount of unnecessary weight. The second chapter I want to tell you about is harder, because it involves an actual real failure, not just an imagined one. A few years after that meeting, I decided to try building something of my own. Nothing dramatic, a small service business, the kind of thing that doesn't make headlines, just something I thought people needed and nobody in my area was doing well. I put together what I had, convinced 2 friends to help, and we spent about a year building it up, and it failed. Not in some clean, instructive way where I can tell you exactly what went wrong and hand you a tidy lesson. It failed messily, the way most things actually fail, from a combination of bad timing, a market that was smaller than I'd estimated, and a few decisions I made that, in hindsight, were driven more by fear of looking indecisive than by good judgment. I want to be honest with you about what that felt like, because I think the sanitized version of failure stories does a disservice to anyone who's actually going through one. It felt like proof, not proof that the business was a bad idea. That would have been a manageable, contained kind of disappointment. It felt like proof about me. Like the failure of the business was really a verdict on whether I was the kind of person who could be trusted with ambition at all. That's the trap, and I want you to notice it clearly if you ever find yourself in it, because it is a lie your mind tells you in the aftermath of a setback, and it is an extraordinarily convincing lie. Failure feels personal. It very rarely is. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to separate those two things, the failure of the venture from some imagined failure of my own worth. And the thing that eventually separated them from me wasn't some grand insight. It was simply time and the accumulation of a few smaller successes afterward that reminded me the failed business was one data point among many, not a final ruling. But I do want to name the mechanism because I think it's useful. Confidence isn't the absence of failure. It's the ability to hold a failure as information about a specific attempt rather than a verdict on a whole self. The people I've met who seem unshakable are not the people who've never failed. They are, without exception, the people who failed the most and simply gotten better at not letting any single failure define the account balance. There's a third chapter I want to tell you about, and this one is less about a single dramatic event and more about a habit I built almost accidentally that turned out to matter more than anything else I'm describing today. After the failed business, I was invited to speak at a small local event, nothing prestigious, maybe 40 people in a room, about what I'd learned, and I almost said no. I actually had the rejection typed out in an email and sat there for probably 20 minutes before deleting it and saying yes instead. And when I stood up in front of those 40 people, my hands were shaking so badly I had to hold the podium the entire time. But something happened in that talk that I hadn't expected. About halfway through, while I was describing the failures honestly without dressing it up, I noticed people leaning forward. Not out of politeness, out of actual recognition. Afterward, 3 different people came up to me separately and said some version of the same thing, that they had a similar fear sitting in them, something they'd been avoiding for exactly the reasons I'd just described, avoiding my meeting all those years earlier. And I understood something in that moment that has stayed with me ever since. Confidence isn't just a private asset that benefits the person who has it. It gives other people permission. When you're willing to be visibly imperfect, visibly uncertain, and still show up anyway, you hand everyone in the room a small piece of evidence that it's survivable. That's not a small thing. That's actually one of the most useful things a person can offer another person. I started saying yes to more of those small opportunities after that, almost as a discipline rather than because I suddenly felt brave. I want to be clear about that distinction because I think it's the actual mechanism behind everything I'm telling you today, and I don't want it to get lost. I did not wait to feel ready. I built a habit of saying yes to things slightly beyond my current comfort on a fairly regular schedule and let the discomfort be the entry fee rather than the deterrent. Small talks led to slightly bigger talks. A willingness to propose ideas in meetings led to being trusted with bigger decisions. A willingness to try again after the failed business led, a few years later, to a second venture that actually worked. Not because I had suddenly become smarter, but because I had accumulated enough survived risk that the fear of trying again had shrunk down to a manageable size. I want to pause here and name something explicitly because I think it's the crux of everything. There is a version of confidence that is fake, and it's worth distinguishing it from the real thing, because a lot of what gets marketed as confidence in the world is actually just performance. It's the loud voice in the room that has nothing behind it. It's the person who never admits a mistake, who talks us over everyone, who mistakes volume for substance. That is not what I'm describing to you, and I want to be very clear about that, because I think chasing that version of confidence actually makes people worse, not better. It makes them brittle. It makes them defensive. It makes them unable to learn, because admitting you don't know something starts to feel like an existential threat rather than an ordinary part of being a person who is still growing. Real confidence, the kind I'm talking about, looks almost the opposite of that from the inside. It's quiet. It doesn't need to win every exchange. It can say, I don't know without flinching, because it isn't built on the idea that you must always be right. It's built on something sturdier. The accumulated evidence that even when you are wrong, even when you fail, even when you're visibly uncertain in front of other people, you remain fundamentally okay. That's the actual foundation. Not, I will succeed. Just, I will be okay whatever happens, because I have been okay before many times under worse conditions than this. Let me tell you about the 4th chapter, because I think it ties a lot of this together, and it's the one that eventually pushed me to think about confidence not just as something personal, but as something with a much larger consequences than I originally understood. After the second business found its footing, I started mentoring a few younger people, mostly informally, people who reminded me of myself at 20, and I noticed something troubling almost immediately, something I hadn't expected to notice. The talent gap between the ones who eventually did remarkable things and the ones who quietly stalled out was almost never about raw ability. It was almost entirely about their relationship with risk. The ones who thrived were not the smartest people I mentored, not by a wide margin. They were the ones who could tolerate the discomfort of trying something in public before they were sure it would work. And that observation genuinely disturbed me for a while, because it meant that an enormous amount of human potential, real capability sits permanently unused in the world, not because people lack the skill, but because they lack the willingness to risk being seen while they're still learning. Think about what that means at scale. Think about how many good ideas never get spoken in a meeting, how many businesses never get started, how many pieces of art never get shared, how many questions never get asked, not because the person lacked the capability, but because somewhere along the way they absorbed the belief that failing visibly was a kind of death, rather than an ordinary and repeatable part of doing anything worthwhile. This is where I think the story stops being just about individual lives and starts being about something bigger, something almost civilizational, if that doesn't sound too grand for what is, on the surface, a pretty ordinary personal quality. Every real advance I've ever read about in any field, medicines, engineering, art, business, starts with someone willing to say an idea out loud before it's fully proven, willing to attempt something before they have any guarantee it will work, willing to be wrong in public on the way to eventually being right. Confidence at scale across a whole society is not a personality trait, it's an engine. It's the thing that converts raw human potential into actual output. Without it, you can have all the talent in the world sitting there inert, never spoken, never attempted, never shared, just because everyone involved is quietly protecting themselves from the temporary sting of being seen not knowing. So when I mentor people now, and when I try to pass along whatever I've actually learned rather than what sounds good in a speech, the thing I focus on is not teaching them facts or frameworks. It's teaching them to shrink the gap between having a thought and voicing it, between having an idea and attempting it, between wanting something and reaching for it. I try to get them small wins early, deliberately, almost artificially at first, because I know that the first few pieces of evidence are the hardest to earn and the most important. Once someone has survived being visibly wrong a handful of times and discovered the world did not end, something shifts permanently in how they carry themselves. It's not loud, it's not dramatic. It's just a quiet, settled willingness to try the next thing without needing to be sure first. I want to say something about fear specifically, because I don't want you to leave here thinking that any of what I've described involves the disappearance of fear. It doesn't. I still feel it. Every time I've done something that mattered, every talk, every difficult conversation, every real risk, the fear showed up first, right on schedule, exactly as it always has. What changed is not the presence of fear. What changed is my relationship to it. I stopped treating fear as a stop sign and started treating it as something closer to a compass. If something scares me in that particular way, not the fear of actual danger, but the fear of being seen, the fear of being judged, the fear of being wrong in front of people whose opinion I care about, I've learned to treat that specific flavor of fear as a signal that the thing is probably worth doing. Not always, not recklessly, but often enough that I now actively look for that feeling rather than avoiding it, because I've learned it usually points toward the exact edge of my own growth. There's a practical piece of this I want to offer you, something more concrete than just a philosophy, because I think principles without practice tend to evaporate the moment you leave the room. The way I actually built this brick by brick was through what I'd call deliberately small, regularly repeated exposure. I did not go from a kid sitting on his hands to speaking in front of large rooms in one leap. Nobody does, no matter what the highlight reel of someone's career makes it look like. I started by saying one honest thing in one meeting that I would normally have swallowed. Then I did it again the following week. I started replying to one difficult email honestly instead of hedging every sentence into meaninglessness. I started raising my hand literally and figuratively in small rooms before I ever did it in large ones. Each of those moments on its own is almost embarrassingly small. Nobody writes a biography about the day someone spoke up in a Tuesday afternoon meeting. But the compounding effect of hundreds of those small moments is, without exaggeration, the entire difference between the persons I was at 19 and whoever I am now. I think this matters especially for you, at whatever point you're at in your own journey, because I suspect many of you are sitting on some version of the idea I sat on for 3 weeks. Some project you haven't started, some conversation you haven't had, some applications you haven't submitted, some question you haven't asked, some room you've been avoiding because some part of you has decided in advance that you'll be found lacking in it. I want to gently push back on whatever verdict you've quietly handed down about yourself, because I promise you, having watched this pattern in dozens of people now, that verdict was almost certainly written by a much younger and much less informed version of you in a moment that had far less to do with your actual capability than it felt like at the time. Let me tell you about the last chapter of this, because I think it's the one that ties everything together, and it's more recent than the others. A little over a year ago, I was asked to take on something significantly larger than anything I'd attempted before, a project with real stakes, real visibility, real consequences if it went badly. And the old fear showed up exactly as it always does, right on schedule, whispering all its familiar arguments. What if this is the one that finally exposes you as not actually capable? What if all the previous survived risks were just luck, and this is the time it finally catches up with you? I want to be honest that the voice never fully goes away. I don't think it's supposed to. But here's what was different this time, and I think this is the actual destination of everything I've been describing. I no longer needed the fear to be absent before I could act. I had enough accumulated evidence, enough small survived risks stacked up behind me, that I could hold the fear in one hand and the decision to proceed in the other, at the same time, without needing to resolve the fear first. That is, as far as I can tell, the actual finish line, not fearlessness, fluency with fear, the ability to keep functioning, keep building, keep speaking, keep trying, with the fear present but no longer in charge. That project, by the way, worked out. Not perfectly, nothing ever does, but well enough, and meaningfully because of decisions I made under that exact tension between fear and forward motion. And I think about the version of me sitting on his hands in that classroom, and I think about how many years separate that moment from this one. And I think the honest answer to how I got from one to the other is not talent, and it's not confidence that arrived from nowhere. It's simply this. I kept choosing to act slightly ahead of how ready I felt, over and over, for long enough that the acting itself became the source of the readiness, rather than the other way around. Before I get to the end of this, I want to tell you about one more thing, something that happened almost by accident, because I think it illustrates a side of confidence that people rarely talk about, and it changed how I think about the whole subject. A few years into mentoring people, I started noticing a peculiar pattern that I had not expected. Some of the people I worked with would take the advice I've just described and swing too far in the other direction. They would hear act before you feel ready and interpret it as act recklessly, ignore preparation, charge into every situation without a plan, because confidence is just a matter of willpower. And almost without exception, that approach backfired for them. They would attempt things they were genuinely unprepared for, not in the productive edge of growth way I've been describing, but in a way that set them up for a kind of failure that actually did damage because there was no foundation underneath the boldness. And when it went badly, instead of learning the lesson I wanted them to learn, they learned a different one entirely. They learned that confidence itself was the problem, that reaching beyond their current ability was dangerous, and they retreated even further into caution than where they'd started. This taught me something important that I hadn't fully appreciated before, which is that confidence and competence are not substitutes for each other. They are partners, and they need to be built together, in a kind of loop, rather than one simply overriding the other. The version of confidence that actually works is not believe in yourself so hard that preparation becomes unnecessary. It's closer to this. Prepare seriously as you're able to, and then, once you've done the preparation available to you, stop demanding certainty before you act. The fear I'm describing throughout all of this is not the fear that stops you from doing your homework. It's the fear that keeps you doing homework forever, using preparation itself as a socially acceptable form of avoidance, because, as long as you're still getting ready, you'd never have to face the moment where your work gets judged. I want to name that trap specifically because I fell into it myself for years without recognizing it. There is a kind of person, and I was one of them for a long stretch of my life, who mistakes endless preparation for responsibility. Reading one more book before starting, taking one more course before applying, refining the plan one more time before pitching it. On the surface, it looks like diligence, and sometimes it genuinely is. But often, if you're honest with yourself, it's actually just fear wearing a very respectable costume. The tell, I've come to believe, is this. Real preparation has a point of diminishing returns, where you can feel yourself no longer learning anything meaningfully new, just circling the same information again out of comfort. If you're honest with yourself about where that point is for you, in whatever you're working on right now, I'd guess most of you already know exactly where it sits, and I'd guess most of you crossed it a while ago. So when I talk about acting before you feel ready, I don't mean acting before you've done reasonable work. I mean acting before the feeling of readiness arrives, because that feeling, as I said earlier, is not reliably connected to your actual level of preparation. Plenty of well-prepared people never feel ready. Plenty of underprepared people feel entirely ready, right up until they're not. The feeling of readiness is a notoriously unreliable narrator, and the sooner you stop consulting it as your primary decision-making tool, the sooner you can start making decisions based on something sturdier. Actual evidence of the work you've done, combined with a tolerance for the part that can only be learned by doing. There's a related idea I want to offer you, because I think it's one of the more freeing realizations I've had, and it has to do with how other people actually perceive confidence from the outside. No, for most of my life, I assumed that confidence, when I saw it in someone else, meant that person had already resolved all their internal doubt. I assumed that the people I admired for their composure simply did not carry the same uncertainty I carried, and that assumption made me feel perpetually behind, like I was missing some starting ingredient that everyone else had been issued and I hadn't. It took me a long time, and a fair number of honest late-night conversations with people I deeply respect, to discover that this was almost entirely false. Nearly everyone I've come to admire for their apparent composure has described, in private, an internal experience that sounds remarkably similar to my own. The same doubt, the same quiet fear of being exposed as less capable than people assume. The difference was never the presence or absent internal. The difference was simply whether they let it drive the car. That distinction matters enormously, and I want to make sure it lands clearly, because I think it's the most liberating part of this entire subject. You are very likely not missing some ingredient that confident people have and you don't. You are very likely carrying the same doubt they carry, and the only real difference between you and them, in this moment, is a decision that hasn't been made yet, whether to let that doubt sit in the passenger seat commenting the whole way, or whether to let it take the wheel. Confident people have not eliminated the doubt. They've simply stopped promoting it to driver. So if I could leave you with one thing today, it would be this. I think about my own kids sometimes, watching them approach the same crossroads I once stood at, and I try to give them something better than what I gave myself for the first 2 decades of my life. I don't try to make them fearless, because I don't think that's honest or even possible. What I try to do instead is celebrate the attempt as loudly as I would have celebrated the success, so that the lesson they absorb early is not only the outcome matters, but the willingness to be seen trying is itself the achievement. I think if more of us had been raised with that lesson, instead of the opposite one, an enormous amount of quiet human potential currently sitting unused in the world would already be out there doing something. I want to close with one final image because I think it captures the whole idea better than any explanation I could give. Picture a locked door that you've walked past for years, always assuming, without ever checking that it's locked. You've built a whole map of your life around the assumption that the door doesn't open, routed everything else around it, made peace with never going through it. And one day, almost by accident, you put your hand on the handle, not because you suddenly became brave, but because you were tired or frustrated, or simply forgot to be afraid for 1 second, and it turns. It was never locked. It was only ever closed, and closed doors and locked doors feel identical from a distance, but they are not the same thing at all. Most of what stands between you and the life you actually want is a closed door, not a locked one, and the only way to find out which kind you're facing is to put your hand on it and turn. Stop waiting to feel confident before you do the thing. That feeling, if you wait for it, may genuinely never come because it isn't designed to arrive first. It's designed to arrive after, as the reward for having gone ahead without it. Find the smallest possible version of the risk in front of you. The meeting where you could say the honest thing instead of the safe thing. The idea you could share instead of sit on. The attempt you could make instead of endlessly preparing for.
And do that small version this week.
Not because it will feel good, it probably won't. Do it because on the other side of it, whether it goes well or badly, you will have one more piece of evidence than you had before. And evidence, unlike feelings, does not evaporate. It stays with you quietly and it compounds. I think about all the people throughout history who did something remarkable, and I no longer believe the story that they were simply born fearless, born certain, born different from the rest of us in some fundamental way. I think, almost without exception, they were ordinary people who decided in one specific moment to act slightly ahead of their fear, and then discovered that the world did not end, and then did it again. That's the whole secret, if you can even call it a secret. It's not glamorous. It's not a single dramatic leap. It's 1,000 small, unglamorous moments of choosing to try before you're sure, stacked one on top of the other, until one day you look back and realize the person who used to sit on his hands is unrecognizable to the person standing here now. Whatever it is you've been sitting on, say it, start it, sense it, ask it, try it. The room is not waiting to catch you failing. Most of the time, it's quietly hoping you'll go first, so that it has permission to try too. Go be the evidence for yourself and for everyone watching you that it's survivable. That's really the whole of it. Thank you.